Everyone, welcome to our very second class together in this class that we call Turning Points. If you weren't here last week, I'll just say that this class is an 8-week course where we're going to go through major events in the history of the Christian church. So if you were with us in the spring, when we talked about church history's greatest hits, we looked at people. Well, this time we're looking at major events. We're calling them turning points. Major moments in the history of the Christian church where things changed or developed in really critical ways, in ways that matter for us even to this day as Christians. So you're very welcome to be here, both if you're here live in the class and also if you're joining us online. I did put a sign-up sheet at the back of the room, and I'm not sure if everyone has seen that yet, but it's very helpful both for our COVID concerns in terms of making sure that this is a safe place for us, but also for me to make sure that I've got your email. So if you get an opportunity, you don't have to do it right now, but at some point before you leave the room, would you just put your name and your email on that list? I promise not to sell it to an advertising company to send you spam, but you will get an email from me. I think it's probably going to be most weeks it's going to be Wednesday when I actually send that email out, because that gives our team here the opportunity to get the video ready for distribution. But pretty much every Wednesday each week that you're in this course, you're going to get an email from me. It will be the video of our class, but then also perhaps a reflection. This week I linked something that I wrote for my seminary on the topic of the resurrection and hope. And so each week you'll get an email with both video and a small reading or a reflection or a devotional or something like that. So feel free to sign that at some point before you leave today, if you would. Let me open us in prayer, if I can, and then we're going to have a reading and we'll jump into our topic today. We've got an exciting topic, which is the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. I think my volume is kicking out. Are you all hearing me okay? But we're looking at the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, and looks like my microphone is dying on me. I think maybe the batteries have gone out. I'm not sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, even in the back? Okay. But we will look at the conversion of the Emperor Constantine today, which is a really interesting topic, especially as we're getting ready to head into a presidential election. So as we, as Christians, think through how to faithfully navigate issues of church and state, hopefully this will be encouraging and helpful to all of us. I will tell you right up front that I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you who I'm voting for. And I'm not really going to get into the weeds of contemporary political issues. You'll probably be very thankful for that because I don't have much to say that's very helpful. But hopefully there'll be some categories we can discuss that will be helpful. So let's open in prayer and then we'll begin. Our Father, we come to you this morning thanking you for this chance to look at this key moment in the history of the church, but also thanking you for a rest and a reprieve from all of the cares and concerns in our lives. You know, Father, in each of our cases what we brought into this room today, whether it's concern over a job, whether it's a broken relationship, whether it's just the normal stresses that all of us go through in a typical week. We thank you, Father, that you are in charge. We thank you that you love us. And we ask that this time would be a reminder of your love for us. Give us a break from the stress, from the concerns, from the worries, and help us to meditate on your goodness to us. We ask you all these things for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, as I said, we are going to be looking at the conversion of Constantine, a Roman emperor. This happened about 1,700 years ago, and it had implications at the time and implications for us even today as Christians living and worshiping in the West. Before we look at that, I would like to open with a reading from a prophet, the prophet Isaiah. So if you have your scriptures, go ahead and turn to the book of Isaiah. And as you're turning, I'll tell you that this morning I got a word from a different prophet, my 4-year-old son, who believes he's a prophet. My 4-year-old recently said something to my wife, and she said, "Jack, you have very good instincts." Well, she said instincts, but he heard intestines. And now he tells everyone, his friends, us, everyone who will listen, that his intestines are telling him this or that. So this morning as I was leaving, I was giving him a kiss, saying goodbye. He said, "Daddy, my intestines tell me this will be a great day." So I hope his intestines are right. But let's look at this other prophet, Isaiah. And in particular, we will look at what Isaiah tells us in chapter 60, and we'll read just the first 3 verses. Isaiah tells us, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn." Now, you can imagine what the Christian church did with these first 3 verses the first time a Roman emperor converted to Christianity. Okay? They interpreted that as a clear fulfillment of the prophecy of the prophet Isaiah that kings will come to the brightness of your dawn. Any of you familiar with the Messiah, with the work of music called The Messiah that many of us will listen to as we go into the Christmas season? One of the songs in The Messiah is a paraphrase of these verses, and so every time I read these verses, I have Handel's Messiah playing in the background for me. But the Christian church very much responded to the conversion of Constantine as a fulfillment of what the prophet Isaiah had said. Kings will come to the brightness of your dawn. Okay? They will come to a realization that Christ is Lord. As we'll see, it's not that simple. Satirist H.L. Mencken said something to the effect of, for every complicated question, there's an answer that's simple, helpful, and wrong. And one of the things that I'll encourage all of us in is thinking carefully about this issue of church and state. Do you want me to hand this to you? All right. I feel like I have a very close friend right now. But in looking at this issue, what we're going to do is look at the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. And as we're doing that, I would like to divide up our time into 3 parts. 3 is a really good number. It's very easy for taking notes. It's very easy for memory. My experience and training as a lawyer tells me that people tend to naturally think in 3s. So I want to do something that was recently recommended to me by a pastor friend. Someone who told me that when he preaches, he often asks 3 questions, okay? And so I would like us to ask 3 questions today about the conversion of Constantine. These are very simple. What, so what, and now what? I like that organization. What, so what, and now what? So we'll look first at the conversion itself. What was the conversion of Constantine? How did it happen? What did it look like? Who was Constantine anyway? Then we'll ask, so what? How, did it have any significance at the time? You know, how did that matter? Thank you. And then finally, okay, there we go. Nice. Then finally we will ask, now what? Thank you, Wayne, I appreciate that. So we'll ask those 3 questions together. So what was the conversion of Constantine? Well, the conversion of Constantine was an event that happened right before a very big battle. Okay, the Emperor Constantine was one of many, many people who was vying to become the emperor in especially the western part of the Roman Empire. Constantine was the son of a very powerful Roman leader. His father was one of the few people who seems to have been in power and who seems to have refused to persecute Christians. Okay? We're not exactly sure if his father was sympathetic to Christianity or just didn't particularly care, but unlike many of the leaders of his day, Constantine's father did not actively persecute Christians. Constantine grew up and got a pretty good education that would have prepared him to one day take over for his father as a political leader. And at a certain point when his father died, Constantine made the decision to throw his hat in the ring, to be one of the contenders to become the emperor of Rome. Now, at this point, Rome was being torn apart by civil wars. There was pretty much an emperor every month. Somebody would take over, he'd reign for a short time, and then he'd be killed and somebody else would take over, and so on. So for an outside onlooker, so for an outside observer, you would have thought that Constantine was just going to be one of these upstarts who throws his hat in the ring, makes an attempt to become emperor, gets killed by his soldiers, and gets thrown into the Tiber or what have you. But that's not what happened. Constantine led an army towards the city of Rome, and the night before the battle, he claims to have had a vision. Anybody heard this story of Constantine's vision? What does he see? He sees, he tells people later, a cross in the sky and the words "in hoc signo vinces" in Latin, which means "by this sign conquer." Okay? Having seen that cross up in the sky, Constantine had his soldiers put a sign of the cross onto their shields. Okay? It's a complicated sign of the cross. It's basically a combination of Greek letters that were the first two letters of Christ's name. Okay, so he has them put a cross symbolizing the name of Christ onto their shields. He goes into battle the next day, and who would have thought? He's victorious, his opponent is slain, and now all of a sudden Constantine becomes emperor. Constantine is one of the most powerful people in the entire world at this point. And he's become a Christian. Now, scholars have debated endlessly how sincere Constantine's conversion was. Was this just a calculated political move? Was Constantine intelligent enough to realize that Christianity was spreading throughout the empire anyway? And as the old saying goes, if you can't beat them, join them. Okay? So there's some cynical scholars out there who would say that Constantine was just a good politician. He realized that the empire was divided on all sorts of grounds and for all sorts of reasons. And so what he wanted to do was actually unite everyone around the Christian cross. So some scholars have said that. Other scholars are convinced that this was a sincere conversion. I'm one of those people who studied Constantine who thinks that this was probably a sincere conversion on his part. We don't know all the details of what he saw or whether he actually did see a cross in the sky. That's his vision that he relates to people later. But it seems like this conversion was sincere. Now, the conversion is significant in a number of ways. Okay, so we've asked what happened? Well, that's what happened. The Roman emperor, for the very first time, became a Christian. But so what? Why did that matter? Well, it mattered at the time because this is the first time that a Roman emperor had become a Christian. Okay? Christ had died about 300 years before, and for 300 years, leading up to this guy Constantine, Christians had a pretty easy time of dealing with the emperor. Okay? He did one of two things. He ignored the Christians, in which case they were generally pretty happy, or he persecuted them. Okay? Christians didn't really have to think through that much, how do we relate to the emperor, because it was pretty clear who he was and what he did. Okay? On good days, he doesn't care about us. On bad days, he has us thrown to the lions. And if you were here with us in the spring, we read some of the accounts of the martyrs who were actually torn to pieces by wild animals at the command of Roman leaders, including Roman emperors. Okay? Now, that changes. Now, the emperor is one of us. Now what? What do we do with that? Okay. All of a sudden, things start changing in the Roman Empire. Constantine starts changing laws. What are some of the laws he changes? Well, he outlaws crucifixion. Okay. It's interesting. It was a tip of the hat to Christians because Jesus had been crucified. Constantine said, as a Christian, I'm going to outlaw that punishment. No one from now on can be crucified. Now, he came up with all sorts of other horrible punishments, including having molten lead poured down people's throats. Okay, it's pretty brutal. I was trying to think what to analogize that to, and I was tempted to ask if anybody saw the presidential debates. But those were worse. No, I'm just kidding. But he was not necessarily a terribly nice guy and came up with all sorts of other punishments, but in a nod to Christians, he outlawed crucifixion. Okay? He outlawed gladiatorial games. If anybody's been to the Colosseum, it's a really imposing structure right in the middle of the city of Rome. And you're tempted to be in awe of it until you realize that this place would have been flowing with blood. This is where people hacked each other to death for the entertainment of thousands watching. Constantine outlawed those. Now, unfortunately, they continued anyway. We know that the gladiatorial games continued for quite some time after Constantine's legislation outlawing them, but he was making an effort. Okay? What are some other things he did? Well, he called Christian councils. Okay? Christians who debated theology with each other now had the emperor sitting at the table while they debated the issues. Okay? That can be good or that can be bad. Okay? Why is it good? Well, it's good in that now we can publicly debate things, and the emperor will even pay for people to travel long distances to get here for these conferences. It's bad in that the emperor is a soldier. You know, he's not a trained theologian. So at some point, one of your kids or grandkids is going to go off to college, or maybe is at college, and is going to take a class with a professor who says Christian doctrine is whatever the Emperor Constantine said it was. Okay? That's not quite true, okay? But Constantine and emperors after him started getting involved in theology. Next week, we'll look at the Council of Chalcedon, which talks about who is Christ. What do we make of Christ? Well, Constantine was responsible for calling the first of those important councils, called the Council of Nicaea. And he actually sat at the council and listened to the debates and at times interjected his own opinions. Okay? This is really different. Now imagine being a Christian who had lived through persecutions before Constantine, and now you're sitting in a room where the emperor is going, that's a really interesting point, Bishop so-and-so. What do you think, Bishop so-and-so, right? And you're going, 15 years ago, emperors were throwing us to lions, and now all of a sudden the emperor is sitting here debating matters of Christology and the Trinity and all these different things. What in the world is happening? Okay? So Constantine's conversion at the time changes a lot, and it changes a lot for Christians. And before Constantine's conversion, it was fairly simple to answer questions of church and state. The emperor either ignores us or he persecutes us. Now all of a sudden he wants to be our friend. Okay? But you all have heard the phrase, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. Okay? At times, following Constantine, there were going to be moments where the emperors were not friends of the church, even though they claimed to be Christians. Okay? Many people since have identified the conversion of Constantine as sort of the moment when everything went wrong. I'm not one of them. I don't agree with it. But some people have seen it happen. Okay? What are some other things that Constantine did that changed things for the church? Well, he started donating buildings to the church. If you've ever been to Europe and seen an old medieval cathedral, the origin of those were public buildings called basilicas that Constantine started to give to the church. You guys want to worship together? Well, you don't have to worship in a house anymore. Here's a giant public building. Just take it. You guys use it. Okay? He started building churches all across the empire. He commissioned Bibles to be printed. Some of our earliest manuscripts are Bibles that were printed at the command of the Emperor Constantine. Okay? So he's doing all of these things. You can imagine, as I said, a Christian who'd lived through persecution before Constantine being a little confused. This is very strange. Okay? So now let's ask our third question. And our third question is what we're going to spend the majority of our time on. What do we make of this? What do we do with this? As I said, now what? Okay? Well, I will tell you that since the conversion of Constantine, there have been two basic ways of thinking about its significance then and for us today. Okay? Here's one of them. A very, very prominent Christian analysis and response to the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine has been, this is the moment everything went wrong. Okay? Now all of a sudden, church and state are intertwined, are intermixed. Now all of a sudden, the church and state have to interact with each other in meaningful ways, and this is when Christianity goes south. This is when Christianity starts to decline. And from that moment on, Christianity has been a religion of imperialism, it has been a religion of conquest and power, and it is fundamentally different from the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Gospels. Okay? So that's one response to the conversion of Constantine. He's the guy that messed everything up. Okay? And where will you find this? What sort of traditions say this? Well, if anyone knows someone who's Anabaptist or leans in that direction, okay? Someone who refuses to take oaths, someone who refuses to serve in the military, Christian traditions like that tend to have Constantine as the ultimate bad guy. Okay? You had Jesus and the disciples teaching a religion of peace. Constantine is an emperor. Now all of a sudden Christianity goes off the rails. Many of these movements are very, very motivated to go back to a pre-Constantinian time and a pre-Constantinian way of thinking. Okay? Constantine is the one who screwed everything up. If we can get back to what the church was like before Constantine, then everything will be better. Okay? Does that make sense? That's one way of looking at this. Here's another way. Okay? An opposite way. This is when everything started to go right. Okay? This is when the church was able to really start growing and advancing and get power and influence. This is when the church could really, really spread the gospel. This is when the church could use the resources of the empire, the roads that the Romans had built, the protections of soldiers and things like that. Now, who says this? Well, folks that have a very, very strong and even aggressive view of the growth of the church and its link to the state. Okay? Christian denominations and groups that think that the church and the state should be very closely melded together. Okay? People who are very comfortable with the medieval settlement in which bishops had political power. Okay? You know some of these people, I'm sure. Okay? You know folks that think that it's a very good thing for the state to encourage a particular religion. Many, many people in the West for hundreds of years thought that the state's job, or at least one of its jobs, was promoting true religion, okay, Christianity in particular, and opposing false religion, okay, snuffing out false religion. Okay? So those are two opposite visions of the conversion of Constantine. On the one hand, he's the guy that messed everything up. On the other hand, he's the guy that actually got us on the right track and has us, pointed in the right direction. This is when things started to go around. I would submit to you that both are wrong. Okay? Both are unhelpful. Both do not offer us the resources that we need as Christians to meaningfully interact with the state. Okay? Why? Because both are simplistic. Okay? Both are overly reductionist. Both say the conversion of an emperor is either a good thing or a bad thing. And the fact of the matter is, events like that can be both. So what I would like to suggest to you in the time that remains to us, and we'll hopefully have some time for discussion, questions, and comments, but what I would like to suggest to you are some resources that come from my favorite theologian, somebody named Augustine. Okay? You all are familiar with Augustine. We talked about him in the spring course, so many of you will be very familiar with him. He was the Bishop of Hippo. He lived and wrote about 100 years after the conversion of Constantine. And in particular, his great work, his magnum opus, was a work called The City of God. And in The City of God, he has an opportunity to respond to both of the extremes that I just set out for you. Because there were Christians in Augustine's day who were saying, oh, if we could only get back to the time before Constantine converted to Christianity. Oh, if only, And then there were Christians in his day who were saying, we need all the emperors to be Christians and Christianity will advance and the Roman Empire will bring about the greatest revival that humanity has ever seen. And Augustine, as I think many, many thoughtful Christians have done since, said, you're both wrong. You're both missing it. Why? Because you're both too certain that you can read what God is doing in history. Okay? And this is, I think, what will be most helpful to those of you who are thinking through how to interact with issues of church and state, how to interact meaningfully with our government, with our leaders. Augustine counsels people to be very reserved and hold loosely to their certainties about what God is doing in events such as the conversion of Constantine. Why? Because we're not God. He has purposes in these events that we may not know. And so here's what Augustine says. It's possible that the conversion of a Roman emperor can be a really good thing for the church. Okay? He builds churches, he commissions Bibles, he allows evangelism now to be legal, He allows the spread of the church to go on unhindered. In some ways, that can be good. But in other ways, that can be bad. Christianity doesn't always do its best work when we're in power. You all know this, right? We don't always do our best job when we've got all the power. Think of the church in China. I mentioned this last week. The church in China, which now is growing exponentially, booming, and thriving, okay, in a regime that's persecuting it. Okay? The church in China has grown exponentially since the government started cracking down. So if you think that you can read God's mind and you can read his plan, you're probably wrong. Okay? Because his ways are not our ways. And so what Augustine says to both groups, and what I would say to both groups, is you're both wrong. You're both convinced that you can look at an event like this and say, aha, I see what God is doing. And Augustine says, hold loose on that. Hold your fire on that. Because we know that God can bring good even out of evil. We know that if Constantine had taken over and embarked on another persecution of the church might have grown even more. We know that God can bring good out of evil, so be careful when you try to analyze these sorts of events. At the same time, what are we to do? Okay? What are we as Christians to do? Well, in answering this, Augustine gives a very, very thoughtful description of the Christian journey through this world. He calls us as Christians members of the city of God, hence the title of that work. And he says, as members of the city of God, we are traveling through the city of man. The city of man is not the city of God. It's not God's kingdom. It's not the church. Okay? But it's still here. And we're still living in it and traveling through it, which means that we have to care about it. Augustine says things that are very similar to something that a sociologist has recently written, a guy named James Davison Hunter, who wrote a book called To Change the World. And what he talks about are the successes and failures of Christians over the last 4 decades in terms of their engagement in political life and in public life more generally. And what Hunter says is something that I think Augustine would say too, which is that Christians should focus on being a faithful presence. Okay? What does that mean? Well, it means being faithful in whatever tasks God has called us to. If you're called to be a policeman, be a good policeman. If you're called to be a judge, be a good judge. If you're called to be a lawyer, be a good lawyer. Pastor, and so on. Teacher. Do your best in the occupations that God has called you to, and work for the peace of the city that you've been called to. You are familiar with the passage in Jeremiah where God's people are counseled to pray for the peace of Babylon, because as it prospers, so will you. Augustine says the same sorts of things when he responds to people who are trying to analyze these sorts of events. He says, recognize that your ultimate home is not here. Your ultimate home is heaven. You are traveling to heaven, but you're traveling through this world on your way to heaven. So be a faithful presence while you're here. Augustine, over and over, gets letters from political leaders, people who have to do the hard things in public life. And they'll tell him, hi, Augustine, I wanted to ask your advice on this. I'm thinking about giving up my job as a judge so I can go join a monastery and get out of this nitty-gritty nonsense. And Augustine says, don't you dare. You stay right where you are. The world needs good judges. Okay? It doesn't need somebody else cloistered away, avoiding that kind of nonsense. When I was an attorney, I saw some of these things close up. If any of you have ever been involved in a divorce or seen a divorce, you know how messy that can be. How judges are called on to analyze situations that are really hard, cases that can involve allegations of child abuse and things like that. We need good judges handling those cases. We don't need judges who are going to take bribes or be unjust. So Augustine over and over and over counsels people to stay in their occupations and do their best. There's a scholar of Augustine I really like who recently gave a talk talking about the need for more mediocre Christians. And he's saying it in a thought-provoking way, right? Because we all want to be super Christians. We all want to be special. We all want to be in front. We all want to have the mic. We all want to be in charge. And what the world needs are more pretty good Christians. Mediocre Christians. Okay? Now, you can take that too far. You understand. Okay? But it's thought-provoking. Augustine wants people in all of their different occupations to recognize that while it's very, very difficult to understand God's workings in history, it's very important in our particular callings to do our best. Augustine has this great place in the City of God where he imagines a Christian judge. And this judge is sitting up on a podium, and he has brought before him a suspected criminal. And the judge orders the criminal to be interrogated. And under Roman law, that'd be a pretty brutal process. And the judge knows that the interrogation might actually induce a false confession. You all know this. People are sometimes inclined to confess to anything if they face a threat of physical violence, right? But the judge knows that if he doesn't interrogate the suspect, then a guilty man may go free and commit another murder. So what does the judge do? Augustine says, he does his job knowing he still may get it wrong. He does his job knowing that he may falsely condemn to death an innocent man. But Augustine says, don't you pity him. Don't you feel bad for him as he tries to do his job. Don't you sympathize with this? Imagine this. Okay? What could he do? Well, he could get down off of the podium and say, I'm done. Take off his judge's robe and go join a monastery. But Augustine says, then what? Then the world goes crazy. We have chaos. We have anarchy. So what does he do? He stays in his job. He does the best he can. He knows he's going to get it wrong at times, and he prays consistently to God, deliver me from my necessities. Okay? Have mercy on me for the mistakes I'm going to make. Again, having been a lawyer, I saw this. I saw judges have to make really, really hard decisions. Sometimes knowing that they were going to hurt someone with their decision, but knowing it'd be worse not to have a decision at all. Those are the hard decisions in political life that we need Christians to make. We need Christians in public life who actually have a conscience. I once asked a scholar of Augustine about this passage. I said to him, what differentiates a Christian judge from a non-Christian judge for Augustine? And the scholar gave a great response. He said, the non-Christian judge sleeps really well. The Christian goes home and he's restless. He thinks to himself, did I really get a just result there? Did I really do a good job? He worries about that. A non-Christian could go home and wipe their, wash their hands and move on. Okay? The Christian actually worries. He wants to make sure that he's actually carrying out justice. So what does this look like for us? It looks like faithful presence, faithful engagement in the occupations and callings that God has for us, which can include public life. Okay? At the same time, Augustine would say that faithful presence does not mean domination. Augustine is concerned with Christians who think that power is the answer to everything. And he knows it's not. Power instills in us pride. It instills in us all of the wrong sorts of instincts. It instills in us a desire to dominate others, to conquer others. And so for Augustine, he's very, very concerned that people like you and me would put all of our trust in power. If we just win this next election, if we just get this guy elected, if we just have one of ours, then everything will be better. And Augustine says, no, it won't. That's not how things work. So be faithfully present. Be faithfully engaged. Be concerned about these things. And at the same time, know that these things are not the ultimate. That these things are difficult to discern. Know, Augustine would say, that God can work out his good plan no matter what happens. If this person gets elected, God can bring good out of it. If that person gets elected, God can bring good out of it. Now, Augustine lives at a time when the world is being held together by a hair. Augustine lives at a time when the Roman Empire is starting to crumble. fall apart. And over, he has people that he counsels to stay in their jobs, to work for peace, to work for justice, to work for the cause of right. But knowing that they're imperfect, they'll get it wrong. They won't always make the right decisions. Now, I hope that some of that is encouraging to you as you think through some of these issues that we face today. How can we get this wrong as Christians when we handle politics? Well, we can get it wrong when we despise it and act like it's meaningless, but we also get it wrong when we glorify it and act like it's the ultimate answer to everything. See? Just like in Augustine's day, just like in Constantine's day, there are Christians who nowadays believe that if we just get certain people elected, the world will be Christian, or will be favorable to Christianity, or Christianity will spread throughout the world, whatever. Okay? On the other hand, there are Christians who think, why would I care about politics? Politics is messy, politics is dirty, all politicians are corrupt, right? Augustine would say, when he looks at somebody like Constantine, when he looks at the kind of situations that we live in, you're both wrong. You have to be engaged, you have to be involved, you have to care, but don't care too much. Once you start caring too much, you start forgetting that we're actually on a journey to another place. So what does that look like now for us as Christians? Well, it looks like Christians who say, I don't know how I'll go on in November if the wrong man wins. I don't know how I'll go on. I don't think the gospel will be able to advance. This will be the death of Christianity. No, it won't. No, it won't. Because we know that God can do whatever he wants. He can bring good even out of evil. And if you believe that a certain person getting elected is evil, then you should know that God can bring good out of it. You should know that with certainty. And you should know that there have been Christians throughout the centuries convinced that the church was going to fall if this or that political leader took over. And the minute that political leader took over, they realized, uh-oh, I did not evaluate that situation correctly. Or 100 years later, we look back and realize, actually, that leader did more for the church than you would have ever imagined, but maybe unintentionally. So one of the best things that can happen to us as Christians is to have a leader who supports us. Another really good thing for Christians is having a leader who persecutes. Both are things that God can use. So as you think through issues surrounding the election, as you think through the candidates, as you think through some of these things, you should be able to have a really, really settled confidence that whatever happens, God has a plan and he's going to bring good out of it. You should also be confident that what you're doing matters. What you're doing matters. If you are working for justice, if you are working for peace, if you are working for goods in our political life, God cares about that. And he wants us to do that as Christians. But he wants us to do that with humility, with a faithful presence attitude that says, I want to be involved in this, but I recognize that I'll mess things up if I get my way and get in charge of everything. I recognize that with power comes great responsibility, and with power comes the potential to screw things up. And so I recognize that while I want to be involved, and while I want to be engaged, and while I want to be faithful, at the same time, I recognize the dangers of power, the perils of having total control. That's most of what I was hoping to say today. I think that might spur some interesting conversation, so I'm curious how you all are thinking about that. I mean, you're having conversations, I'm sure, with friends and neighbors, some of whom I'm guessing are on one or the other sides of these things. Without talking about, which candidate do we want to vote for, what are you all hearing and how are you all engaging with this? I mean, you have a lot of conversations with people that think that the church is going to come to an end if a certain person gets elected. I mean, is that, I'm having these conversations, so, yeah.
I haven't had that conversation.
Yeah. What about others?
People that are feeling uneasy and stressed, desiring their person to be elected, and if not, they're not going to be happy, but not that it would wipe out Christianity.
As a student of history, I always get a kick out of people saying, there has never been a time when politics has been
Yes.
this contentious, you know, and I think like, have you heard of the 1790s, you know? Go watch Hamilton. I mean, there was a man that got shot, you know? Like, yes, it's contentious and it's stressful, you know, but it's been worse. Yeah,
Instead of talking about right now,
yeah,
I think I had some presumption, but I want to ask you.
yeah.
Speak up.
I'm thinking about.
I'll repeat it too.
I'm thinking about the Roman Catholic Church.
Uh-huh,
Was he majorly responsible for kind of the explosion
Yes.
of that?
yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, very thought-provoking, and worth thinking about just a little bit here. So the question is, what is Constantine's role in terms of the expansion of what we would think of as the Roman Catholic Church? Right, it's a very good question. Constantine is very much at the center of the establishment of what scholars have called the medieval settlement. Okay, a situation where the church has huge amounts of power in politics. If you read about the medieval period, you'll know that bishops owned most of the land in Europe. Taxes went to bishops who were in charge of churches. Constantine is very much the originator of that in the West.
And
So,
there was another assumption I had, so
Yeah.
that it could be the good thing about Christ going out.
yep,
The bad thing is to declare everybody in Rome a Christian,
yeah,
and you're just Christian because now you want to be a Christian because you're Roman, and we don't become Christians like that. It's a one-on-one personal thing.
Yep.
So that's the negative about not understanding by grace you're saved.
and so again, just to kind of reiterate, both for folks here, but also folks on camera, the follow-up to that is also very good, which is one of the good things about the conversion of Constantine may be, well, the church is expanding, it's now free to evangelize and so on. But a potential negative is the identification of Roman citizenship with Christianity. Okay? This doesn't happen right away with Constantine, but over the next decades, Roman emperors finally declare Christianity to be the religion of the Roman Empire. And very much like you'll have conversations with somebody where you say, I'm a Christian, and they'll say, oh, I'm a Christian too. And you say, well, what does that mean to you? I can tell you about what that means to me, but what does that mean to you? And they say, well, I'm an American, I was born in Florida. Okay. There's kind of that sort of thing through the medieval period too, where everyone is baptized at birth. Your entry into political life and your entry into the church happen at the same time. You become a citizen of a German state or France or what have you at the same time that you become a member of the church. And that can have hugely negative consequences for the church, and did. Where political citizenship gets equated with Christianity, that's potentially very dangerous, very problematic. I think most of us would agree with that. Most of us have had conversations with people who think that being an American makes them Christian. Yeah.
Can we say that the Reformation then connected
Oh yeah.
in some way to the conversion?
Much of the Reformation, especially in the second wave of the Reformation, so not necessarily the initial reformers, but their immediate descendants, were very opposed to the Constantinian settlement. They were very opposed to the idea that your membership of a political body would be the same as your membership of the church. So you can see in the Reformation, especially in its second wave, a real reaction to those abuses. And I think it's a reaction that many of us feel to this day. Most of us are pretty convinced that becoming a Christian is a very personal decision, as opposed to something that the state would mandate for us or tell us to do or even encourage us to do. I mentioned in the talk a few minutes ago that some people have said with friends like that you don't need enemies, right? There is a sense in which having political power can be very bad for us, okay? It can be very bad for us. And you see this every time a very powerful Christian leader falls. It actually does a huge amount of harm to the gospel, right? So when I say to my neighbor, and I've had these kinds of conversations in the last couple of months, but one to the neighbor that lives very close to my wife and I, I'm a Christian, and I was telling her where I worship and telling her a little bit about that. She immediately brought up the names of 3 people she had seen in the news, and I won't say their names, but you know who they are. It says, so like that, you're a Christian like that guy, or this person. I was like, well, no. You know, but we can deceive ourselves that having political power will advance the gospel. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it actually hurts the gospel. And so that's why Augustine and others would counsel us just to hold loose on that. Don't be so sure. Might be good. It's fine to work for it, you know, but be careful. Yeah.
Do I understand this correctly as far as people were born into politics or born as a Christian?
It's what I'm saying in terms of the medieval settlement is that during the medieval period and until very recently, actually, in much of Europe, when you were born, you were baptized, and your baptism was also your certificate of citizenship. You know, so the baptismal record, okay, in the church was the same thing as your certification of birth and citizenship and all those things in the state. So there's a very clear merging of church and state there, right?
So where do people turn into politicians? If
Oh,
everyone was
well,
a Christian
that-
at
that-
the beginning.
Yeah, that'd be a completely different thing. So I'm not saying that you're born a politician, no, but
Okay.
just you're in much of Europe under this Constantinian settlement, your entry into being a member of the state happened at the same time as your membership of the church. You know, the two were kind of merged or intertwined. Yeah.
You stated that you felt that his conversion was sincere.
Yes.
Can you give us a few reasons or evidences?
So one of the main reasons why scholars, and I include myself in this, consider Constantine's conversion to be sincere is because of what a risk it was. So Roman emperors for hundreds of years were tasked with keeping the old religion intact, you know, whatever that meant. Romans hated innovation. Okay, we're not like that. We love the new, we love the cutting edge, the Roman word superstition was the same word they used for innovation. Okay? So a superstitio, the Latin word superstitio means new thing. They don't like that. So for a Roman emperor to come in and say, I am now worshiping a Christian God, and to start really, really pushing out the old religions was a big risk. And so it seems unlikely to many people that he would have taken that big of a risk if he was just a shrewd political manipulator. There would have been easier ways to do that. Now, some of the things that are very interesting about Constantine that we didn't discuss include the fact that he wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. And so he held off being baptized until the very end. That might be because he had this goal of being baptized in the Jordan. He wanted to be baptized in the Jordan and never got to that. But some scholars have looked at that and said, that's odd. If he were a Christian, wouldn't you think he would have gotten baptized earlier? That's kind of a little complicated. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Got a couple minutes here. Constantine was not necessarily a nice fellow. He had his son and his son's wife and several other people murdered during his reign. So he was still a Roman, you know, and he wasn't necessarily a pleasant fellow. The story about his death is that shortly after he died, at his command, he was buried in a coffin, a sarcophagus that was placed strategically between 6 coffins on either side, okay, to symbolize the 12 apostles. Okay, so if you read somebody like Eusebius, who's our primary source on Constantine, he treats Constantine like the Messiah. I mean, there's Jesus and then there's Constantine. And that is the kind of attitude that people like Augustine are uncomfortable with. You know, don't start talking about political leader as the Lord's anointed, as his Messiah. That's problematic. Yeah.
Was that the beginning of the popes in that era?
Sorry?
The popes?
There have been bishops in Rome, but it's very much the beginning of their power, and especially their political power. Yeah, Constantine's conversion and the location of the Pope in Rome are very, very important. So Constantine gives the Pope tremendous property in Rome, you know, including what's now the Lateran, you know, where the Pope lives and works. That's a gift from Constantine. Yes.
So it was the Roman Catholic Church actually grew during Constantine's reign.
So, yeah, terms like Roman Catholic can be a bit anachronistic because, at least in the West, for hundreds of years, it's the only church. It isn't set apart from Protestantism for hundreds and hundreds of years. But again, to points several of you made, the conversion of Constantine is very much responsible for what we think of as the medieval Catholic Church. The fact that the church had huge amounts of political power very much traces back to Constantine. Yeah.
Easter and Christmas, is there?
Yep, there is a connection. Constantine certainly celebrates those and encourages people to celebrate those holidays. Christmas in particular.
And what's they like pagan holidays or something?
Christians, and Constantine is not alone in this, Christians were very good at baptizing pagan practices. Okay, so think about the use of the basilica. So the church as we know it was originally a law court building. It was used for pagan trials and sometimes even for pagan worship. Christians washed it out, and said we're going to make this a church. They did that with things like holidays as well. Everybody's observing a certain holiday on a certain day or in a certain season. It would make sense that we actually do that at that time, but serve the true God while we're doing it. Christians were very comfortable taking pagan practices and I can't think of a better word than baptizing them, making them Christian. I don't find that to be concerning at all. That has never bothered me. There's a letter from Augustine, but not of Hippo, a different Augustine of Canterbury, who's a missionary to the UK, to Britain. And in this exchange with someone else, what he says is that every time we find a pagan temple, we wash it out, clean up the altar, and then put a crucifix in there and start proclaiming the true religion. And people show up thinking that we're going to be pagans, and actually we tell them about the true religion. I think Christians could learn from that. I think that when you hear people say, I can't celebrate Christmas because it was originally a pagan holiday, I don't really understand that. Because it's not a pagan holiday, it's a Christian holiday. And if it began in terms of when that was celebrated as a pagan holiday, Christians took that and said, that's ours. Augustine has this really, really delightful metaphor that I've shared with you in the past called plundering the Egyptians. And if you're familiar with the story of the Exodus, when the people of God leave Egypt and go into the Promised Land, they take everything that wasn't nailed down, right? They leave Egypt with everything, And Augustine says, when we take pagan things, okay, and make them ours, we're plundering the Egyptians. It's a really interesting metaphor. You've got this holiday, we're going to call it Christmas, and we're going to make it about Christ. It's ours now. Sorry. And the idea behind that, which I think is very helpful for us even to this day, is that if it's true, it's ours. If something's good, that comes from our God, and He's giving it to us. Maybe last question. We probably have time for one more question here. Who wants to give the final word? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Not really. All right. Well, assuming we don't have any other questions, then you're welcome to come up and ask me questions. Yeah.
So, when Constantine became a Christian,
Mhm.
they didn't call it Catholic. I mean, it says you mean Jew
Yeah.
person. They were just Christians.
Correct.
The early centuries, they were just Christians.
Yep.
Not Roman Catholic.
Correct.
Christians.
You do not have Roman Catholic as a category until the Protestant Reformation, which is essentially the 1500s. Constantine's living 1200 years before that. So, I get asked this fairly often, was Augustine a Catholic? Well, if you mean by Catholic, was he part of what he saw as the universal church, which is what that term Catholic means, then sure. If you mean was he a Roman Catholic, no, because that category didn't even exist yet.
That's what I find as
Yeah.
my Catholic roots are.
Yes.
Most people think we're the original church.
Mhm.
You guys got it messed up.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
original. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I've had many of those conversations with Catholic friends too. Say no. I'm part of the original church too.
Well,
All right.
that's in the Apostles' Creed.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
The Catholics have a capital C and the
Yeah.
Protestants have a small c.
Many Protestant churches, and I grew up in several of them, will have a little asterisk next to the word Catholic in the different creeds. Say we don't mean Roman Catholic.
Just tell them the original church is Jewish.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that note, I am looking forward to seeing you all next week. Next week, we talk about creeds and councils, and especially the Council of Chalcedon, where really in a very definitive way, the divinity and humanity of Christ is hammered out. Okay, so a really, really important issue in the church is, for hundreds of years, who is Jesus? You know, who is this guy? What do we make of him? Is he God? Is he man? Is he both? How does that work? Council of Chalcedon is really, really critical for that. And so we will talk about that and its implications for us. I hope this was helpful. I hope it inspires thoughts as we head into this election season, but also as you interact with friends and neighbors and talk to people about your faith and what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a Christian who engages with public issues and public life. So I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks, as always, for being here, and see you then.